how have city officials now responded to, Trump's demands, really, to how they approach these protests?
Well, it's really set up Trump as being kind of in opposition to these local leaders. And that's different from some past crises that we've seen in places like New York and Washington, D.C. We've heard local officials have really strong criticism of what Trump has said, what he said in the Rose Garden last night in his brief remarks, of his actions walking across Lafayette Square to St. John's Church. We heard sharp criticism of that from Muriel Bowser, for example, the D.C. mayor. And so I think that a lot of times when you look back at past crises where there was talk about federalizing the National Guard or taking other actions, often what we saw was local officials acting in concert and being supported by federal officials. But this seems to be unfolding differently, where we're seeing local officials really being very critical of what they see as kind of a heavy hand that's being taken by the White House and by the federal government. And so that really sets up kind of this potential, powder keg where you have local officials really not liking federal officials coming in with the military and taking these actions against their citizens. So that's certainly a dynamic to watch going forward.
Yeah, Kathleen, talking about that, how solid is the legal precedent then for the president to deploy troops on U.S. soil? We talked with the former British ambassador to the U.S., and he was talking about the late 60s as precedent. Obviously, there's talk of Los Angeles as well, decades ago. But even there were very different circumstances. So what's the precedent that people are referring to here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Anna, we're really in uncharted territory here because, again, as I referenced earlier, in these past situations, a lot of the time it was the local governments that were saying to the federal government, look, we're not able to handle this. Please come in and help us. That isn't the situation here. Really, we're seeing local governments kind of pleading with the federal government not to act as strongly as they're threatening to act. And so I think that what the White House is looking at, by all accounts, is an 1807 law called the Insurrection Act, which essentially gives the federal government some authority to sort of put down unrest that might threaten citizens' civil liberty. When that has been invoked in the past, though, it's been invoked with the support of local officials. And so this, in some ways, would be certainly very open to legal challenges if the president does look to, deploy particularly not just the National Guard, but active duty military, because there is also a Civil War era law that essentially says that the military can't be deployed on U.S. soil unless there are very special circumstances. And so I think that's where the rub is going to be. And certainly if Trump does take some of the action that he's talking about. Yesterday, we saw Tom Cotton, who's a U.S. senator, a Republican senator, and a close Trump ally, call, for instance, for the 101st Airborne Division to be deployed to help put down some of these protests in Minneapolis. And I think that if a step like that were taken, that would certainly be very unprecedented and probably open to a host of legal challenges.
Can Biden, Kathleen, make this issue work for him in the election? Because the Black Lives Matter movement was born under, Biden's time in the White House as vice president. The Ferguson issue happened on his watch.
Yeah, and I think that yesterday was really very much a split-screen moment in the sense that, we saw Biden talking about the need to deal with structural racism that exists in America, talking about the need for unity and calm, and whereas we saw Trump, by contrast, having a very different message, talking about the need to act with resolve and toughly and potentially deploy troops. And so I think that the difference between the candidates on this issue was put into stark relief yesterday. I think the question, though, is which appeals more to U.S. voters. Certainly, I think this is making it more of a base election where, we could see folks on the right and the left being energized more to come to the polls because of the things that are unfolding in the U.S. right now. And the question is which side wins out on that in specific states, in these battleground states, whether that has more of a benefit to Trump or to Biden, and then also how independent voters feel in light of all this. This is yet another reason potentially for people to stay away from the polls. Not only do they have to worry about social distancing and coronavirus, now there's all of this civil unrest that's occurring. Of course, we're 5 months out from the election, but, it's a little bit more of a reason potentially for people to stay home. And so I think it's hard to tell right now at this stage which candidate is going to benefit more or whether Biden's going to be able, to your point, Matt, make this into an issue that works for him. But I think that it certainly is emerging as a huge issue in the campaign.